Okay, so get ready because this deep dive you guys sent us on is pretty intense. We're going to be looking at a bunch of stories where love goes bad, like really, really bad,
Yeah, and these aren't like made up stories or anything. These are real cases, and they're all in this book called Os Homens Apaixonados que Mais Rav na Historia.
which translates to
The men in love who made the biggest mistakes in history.
catchy title.
It is, it is. And it's actually part of this whole series called Strange Loves, and it's by this Brazilian author, Heverton Anunciação. He does like relationship advice and self-help stuff. But this book is totally different.
So before we get into all the details, I think we should make one thing super clear.
Definitely.
We're not saying any of this stuff is okay.
Right.
What we're trying to do is figure out what's going on here. What can we learn about, like, love and obsession and the dark side of people from these stories?
It's crazy how different all these cases are. Different cultures, different times, but they all have this same, like, thread running through them. It's like possessiveness and jealousy turning love into something that's used to control people. And the consequences, well, they're usually pretty awful.
Yeah, like that story about neighbor Coutinho Jr. He was this Brazilian guy, and he was under a ton of financial stress, and he ended up killing his wife and kids.
And himself, too.
Right. And he left this note, and it almost sounded like he thought he was protecting his family from suffering by doing this horrible thing.
I know, it's chilling. That case really shows you how someone can get so desperate and twisted up in their sense of responsibility that they do something totally unthinkable.
And then you have these cases that seem to come from more of a, like, primal place, like that story about Herod.
Oh, yeah, he was totally obsessed with Herodias. She was his brother's wife, by the way.
It's like some Shakespearean drama,
Totally. And to get her, he had John the Baptist beheaded.
just like that.
Pretty much. I mean, talk about obsession.
That's next level. And it makes you think about all those cases where jealousy and, like, this idea of wounded honor lead to violence against women. It makes you wonder about, like, the norms in society and how different cultures view masculinity. Like, is possessiveness just seen as a way to show love in some places?
Absolutely. It brings up a lot of questions, for sure.
There's that really intense case of Doca Street in Brazil.
Oh,
Right?
yeah, Doka Street. So he was this rich playboy, and he got in a fight with his girlfriend, Angela Diniz, and shot and killed her.
What?
Yeah. And his lawyers actually tried to use this legitima defesa de honra defense,
Sure.
like legitimate defense of honor, because, she was supposedly promiscuous.
Seriously, that's insane.
I know, right? It really shows you what the attitudes were back then. But the good news is people were outraged, especially feminist groups, and they pushed for another trial. And eventually, Doak Street was found guilty.
So things did change.
Yeah, thankfully. It just goes to show how things that were once considered acceptable can become totally unacceptable as society evolves.
It really makes you think about, like, challenging those old beliefs we all have. But, not all of the cases in this book are about violence like that. There are also these really messy stories about, like, toxic love and addiction.
Right, like Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, their whole relationship was a disaster. Heroin, codependency, it was just a constant spiral downwards. It's really tragic, especially in that whole punk rock scene they were in.
It really makes you think about how those lines between love, recklessness, and self-destruction get blurred. It's almost like a cautionary tale. What's the author's angle on all this? Is he just, like, presenting the facts, or is he trying to go deeper?
No, he definitely goes beyond just the facts. He actually tries to get inside these guys' heads, trying to figure out their motivations, what really drove them to do what they did.
So it's like he's painting a more complex picture of behavior. Speaking of complex, what about the case of Naveen and Sonam Daigar? They were this young couple in India and totally in love, but they weren't allowed to get married because of their clan's traditions.
Right. And they were so desperate to be together that they ended up poisoning their entire family.
Their whole family.
Yeah. It's a really intense case because it makes you think about how different cultures clash, like the idea of Kap panchayats. Those are these informal councils that control things in some villages in India. It's probably not something most people are familiar with. But they have a ton of power in those communities. And in this case, they basically took away Naveen and Sonam's choices. It really makes you question how cultural pressures shape how we see love and what the consequences can be. Going through all these cases, it's really striking how easily love can become toxic.
Yeah, you start to see a pattern.
It's this poison. like a slow poison that just eats away at the relationship, fueled by insecurity and all this possessiveness.
And sometimes that poison just explodes into violence.
Yeah,
Exactly.
like in the case of Ezequiel Miranda da Silva.
Oh, right. Ezekiel.
He was obsessed with his neighbor Isabella, but she wasn't into him. And that unrequited love, I guess, it turned deadly. He ended up stabbing her to death.
That case really shows you how important it is to respect boundaries. You can't force someone to love you. Love can't be manipulated. And even though rejection hurts, it doesn't give anyone the right to be violent.
It's scary to think that someone would think that's okay.
I know. And it's interesting how a lot of these cases also tie into how society views masculinity and entitlement.
Yeah, like that case with Rodrigo Augusto de Padua, the guy who was obsessed with that TV presenter Anna Hickman.
Oh, yeah. He was convinced they were destined to be together, held her and her whole family hostage at gunpoint.
It's chilling to think about how distorted fantasies can become.
Absolutely. And that sense of entitlement, like he had some right to her, it can be so destructive.
Totally. And it feels like we see that same pattern with Felipe Camargo, the actor who was accused of breaking his partner's arm during a fight. Vera Fisher, I think.
Yeah, Vera Fisher. They had a super intense relationship. It was all passion and drama and accusations and jealousy.
A total mess.
It really is like a textbook example of how love can turn into a war zone.
Right.
Where all those fights escalate into violence and abuse.
And you see that kind of pattern across different cultures and times.
Oh, absolutely. Look at Sean Penn and Madonna. Even with all the fame and fortune, their marriage was full of these accusations of domestic violence.
That incident where he allegedly tied her to a chair and beat her is just horrifying.
It shows you that domestic violence can happen to anyone, no matter how rich or famous you are. And often it's hidden, kept quiet. People are afraid to speak out.
Right. Which just allows the problem to continue.
Exactly. And the same goes for Chris Brown and Rihanna. They seem like this perfect couple. And then, boom, he assaults her. It was a huge wake-up call for a lot of people. It brought the issue of domestic violence into the spotlight, even in those seemingly glamorous celebrity circles.
It forced people to talk about accountability, the cycle of abuse, and supporting victims. And it also showed how the media can really shape public opinion. We have a responsibility to question those harmful stereotypes and narratives.
For sure. And, when we talk about accountability, the case of Christian Chavez from that pop group RBD is a good example.
There.
Well, he was arrested after a violent fight with his boyfriend at the time, Benjamin Stewart Kruger, I think.
It just shows that domestic violence isn't limited to any gender or sexual orientation.
Absolutely. It can happen in any relationship.
The author also goes into other dark sides of celebrity culture, like Phil Spector.
Oh, Phil Spector, legendary music producer, but he ended up shooting and killing Lana Clarkson, an actress. It's a real cautionary tale about power, substance abuse, and a history of violence.
It makes you wonder if all that artistic genius stuff is just a mask, hiding all the personal demons.
It's a question we keep coming back to, right?
Totally. And then you have the O.J. Simpson case. That was a media circus.
It really was. It was all about celebrity and media manipulation and everyone being obsessed with true crime. Even though Simpson was found not guilty of killing his ex-wife Nicole Brown or Ron Goldman, a lot of people still believe he did it.
And it really put the issue of domestic violence front and center.
It did. Even though he wasn't convicted, the trial revealed a history of abuse in their relationship. All those warning signs that people often miss.
It makes you realize how important it is to pay attention to those red flags, like controlling behavior, verbal abuse, escalating aggression. You need to act before it gets worse because sometimes love itself can be a weapon.
That's so true. You don't need a physical act of violence for there to be abuse. The emotional and psychological damage can be just as bad.
Right, and the book goes into cases like that too, where the men manipulate and coerce and abuse their partners psychologically. They use their supposed love as a way to control and isolate and ultimately harm the other person.
It's terrifying how insidious that kind of abuse can be. It can slowly destroy someone's self-esteem and sense of agency.
Like in the case of Vanderlei Gonçalves Quintão,
Yeah.
the engineer who made that pact with his fiancée.
To kill anyone who knew about her past relationships.
Yeah. I mean, talk about controlling behavior. It's like he wanted to completely erase her past and create a new one for her based on his own twisted ideas.
It's just disturbing. That level of possessiveness is just monstrous. And it's interesting how his lawyers tried to use the whole she was promiscuous defense again, trying to shift the blame.
It's sad how often that happens. blaming the victim.
Yeah.
It just reflects all that deep-rooted sexism in society.
It does, and thankfully in his case he was convicted. But it just goes to show how much those attitudes still exist.
And how much context matters when we talk about these issues.
Absolutely.
Like Lindomar Castillo, the Brazilian singer who shot and killed his wife.
Galeana de Gramont, right.
Yeah. He shot her in a jealous rage. Their whole relationship was full of abuse. But at first, the media portrayed him as this heartbroken guy.
It's crazy how societal norms can distort our view of what's acceptable.
It's like they were romanticizing the violence.
It often takes public outrage and the tireless work of women's rights activists to make sure guys like Lindomar are held accountable.
And to make sure those narratives about love and violence get challenged. We need a society where love is about respect, equality, and freedom, not possession or control.
That's the key. It's so important to remember that love itself isn't the problem. It's how it gets twisted and distorted that leads to these tragedies.
That's a really good point.
Right.
These stories are scary, but we can't let them make us cynical about love altogether.
Right. Instead, they should be a way for us to learn, to see the warning signs and try to build relationships based on trust and respect and healthy boundaries. Love shouldn't be about pain and control.
This should be something positive and supportive, right?
Exactly.
It's wild, right? All these cases together, it's like this messed up tapestry of obsession and jealousy and societal pressure. And every story is like a reminder of just how dark things can get in relationships.
And the scariest part is how some of these guys try to make their actions seem rational. Like they twist things around in their heads to justify what they did. Like Antonio Marcos Pimenta Neves, the journalist who killed his ex.
Cedric Gawai.
Right, Sandra Gomez. And she broke up with him and he just couldn't handle it.
His case was so shocking because
Yeah.
he was this well-known guy, and it was also calculated,
Mm-hmm.
But then he tried to play the victim, like she drove him to do it because she rejected him.
It's that classic blame the victim tactic that we see so often in domestic violence cases. It's a way to avoid taking responsibility and try to get sympathy.
It's just awful.
Yeah.
But at least he was found guilty.
Yeah, which is a win. But his case shows how much we still need to talk about emotional abuse and how damaging it can be.
It's true. Sometimes you can't even see the scars it leaves. And when we talk about manipulation and control, that case with Lindenberg Alves Fernandez really sticks with you. And the guy who held his ex-girlfriend hostage.
Eloa Pimentel, yeah. It went on for days, and then he ended up killing her during that standoff with the police. Such a tragedy.
I remember that. She was so young.
And the media just wouldn't leave it alone. It was everywhere.
It was heartbreaking.
It definitely raised a lot of questions about how the media covers hostage situations and how we support victims of abuse. And it makes you think about those abusers, their need for control, and how much damage their actions cause, not just to the victim, but everyone around them.
Right, like the families. And when you talk about the impact on families, you have to think about the case of Mizel Bispo, the cop who killed his ex.
Marcy Nakashima. Yeah, that one was rough because he planned it all out so carefully and tried to hide what he did.
So cold-blooded.
It shows how dangerous it can be when people in positions of power abuse that power. And it also shows that sometimes even law enforcement needs to be held accountable.
Absolutely. And then there's that whole case with Sergio Gomes, another police officer. But this time he was involved in a plot to kill the Greek ambassador.
Kyriakos Amiridis, yeah. And it turned out the ambassador's wife was in on it.
It's like something out of a movie. So much betrayal and then murder on top of it.
It's a stark reminder of how greed can corrupt people, how it can drive them to do terrible things.
And how quickly love and loyalty can disappear when there's money or power involved.
It's scary to think about.
It is. But these cases, as crazy as they are, they're just a small piece of the whole picture. There's so much love gone wrong happening every day.
Yeah, it's not just a few isolated incidents, it's a bigger problem. It's rooted in how our society views men and women, all that toxic masculinity, and how we often accept possessiveness and control as normal in relationships. That's why it's so important to keep talking about this stuff and to challenge those harmful ideas.
We need to teach young people about consent and boundaries and how to recognize those red flags, both in their own relationships and with their friends and family.
We need to make sure victims have a safe place to go, that they know how to get legal help and counseling.
It's a huge issue.
It is, and we need to tackle it from all sides.
It's been intense, this deep dive. We've gone to some pretty dark places.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
But I hope it makes people want to do something, make a change.
I agree. We can't just sit here and feel afraid or cynical about love. We have to use these stories as a push to make things better.
So after hearing all this, I hope everyone listening really thinks about their own choices in relationships.
Let's work towards a world where love is a good thing. A positive force, not a weapon.
Because love should bring out the best in us,
Yeah.
not the worst.
Exactly. It's something to keep in mind, something to strive for.